Emily Carter had spent 12 years chasing a life she thought she was supposed to want. By 34, she had a respectable job in the city, a tiny apartment she could barely afford, and a constant feeling that every new morning was just another race she was already losing. Burned out, exhausted, and with little more than a few $100s left after walking away from everything, she made a decision that sounded completely irrational. Instead of starting over somewhere safe, she drove to a forgotten mining town and spent her last $150 on a rusted old tin shop everyone else considered nothing more than a collapsing pile of scrap metal. The auctioneer laughed. The locals shook their heads. Some even wondered how long it would take before she gave up and disappeared back to the city. But 3 weeks later, while removing a warped sheet of tin from the back wall, Emily heard a hollow sound that shouldn't have been there. Behind the rusted panels was a sealed iron door no one remembered, and hidden beyond it were records that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase from history. What she discovered inside would change not only her own life, but everything an entire town believed about its past. Before we uncover what was hidden behind that forgotten door, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Leave a comment below so I can say hello to our amazing community around the world. If you're just starting your day, I hope today brings you peace, good health, and at least one wonderful surprise. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with mystery, forgotten family legacies, and inspiring new beginnings, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next unforgettable journey. Now, let's go back to the day Emily bought the old tin shop that everyone else believed was worthless. Emily Carter stared at the cardboard box on her apartment floor, wondering how 12 years of working in downtown Chicago could be reduced to a handful of books, 2 framed photographs, a coffee mug with a chipped handle, and a faded denim jacket she had not worn in years. The office keycard rested on top of the box, like a reminder of a life she had finally chosen to leave behind. 3 days earlier, she had walked into her manager's office, placed the badge on the desk, thanked everyone for the opportunity, and quietly resigned. There had been no dramatic speech, no argument, and no celebration. Only relief mixed with fear. Friends called her decision reckless. Her parents begged her to reconsider. They reminded her that stable jobs were difficult to replace and that people did not simply abandon careers in their 30s without a plan. Emily wished she could explain the exhaustion that had settled inside her for years, but she no longer had the energy to defend herself. Every morning had begun with crowded trains, endless meetings, and deadlines that only led to more deadlines. Every evening ended with takeout containers, unanswered messages, and the uneasy feeling that she was surviving instead of living. Selling most of her furniture had left her with only a modest amount of money. After paying her remaining bills, she counted the cash one final time before folding it into her wallet. It was enough to start somewhere new if she lived carefully, but not enough to make mistakes. That should have made her cautious. Instead, it pushed her toward the one decision nobody around her could understand. She drove west with everything she owned packed into her aging hatchback until the skyline disappeared behind rolling hills and quiet highways. The destination was Ash Creek, a former mining town she had stumbled across while browsing online property listings late one sleepless night. Among abandoned storefronts and neglected buildings sat a listing so strange she assumed it was a joke. An old tin repair shop for sale at auction with a starting price of $150. The photographs showed rusted walls, broken windows, and a sagging roof. Most buyers had ignored it. Emily could not explain why she kept returning to those pictures. Maybe it was because the building looked forgotten in the same way she felt. Ash Creek welcomed visitors with faded signs and empty sidewalks. Several storefronts had been boarded up for years, while others struggled to stay open. An elderly man sweeping dust from outside a hardware store glanced toward Emily's car before returning to his work. Nothing about the town suggested opportunity, yet it felt strangely peaceful. The auction attracted only a small crowd. Most people gathered more for entertainment than serious bidding. When the auctioneer reached the tin shop, he barely bothered raising his voice. $150, he called. Silence answered him. Someone near the back chuckled. Emily lifted her hand. Sold! For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then laughter spread through the group. One man shook his head. City folks really will buy anything. Another muttered that repairing the roof would cost more than the building itself. Even the auctioneer smiled as he handed Emily the paperwork. Good luck, he said. You'll need plenty of it. Emily forced a polite smile, signed the documents, and accepted the old brass key. It felt surprisingly heavy in her palm. She drove the short distance to the property and parked outside the weathered building. The faded sign above the entrance had long since lost most of its paint, leaving only a few letters visible beneath rust and dust. Inside, sunlight filtered through cracked windows, illuminating years of neglect. Cobwebs stretched between shelves. Bent sheets of tin leaned against one wall. A broken workbench occupied the center of the room. The place smelled of old wood, iron, and rain that had seeped through the roof over countless seasons. It was nothing like the apartment she had left behind. Yet, for the first time in months, she felt no pressure to hurry. She rolled up her sleeves, opened every window she could, and began cleaning. Dust filled the air as she swept the floor, sorted piles of scrap, and stacked anything that looked reusable. Progress came slowly, but each cleared corner made the shop feel a little less abandoned. By late afternoon, sweat clung to her forehead, and her arms ached from lifting heavy metal sheets. She stepped behind the rear storage area, where worked panels of tin had been fastened over an older interior wall. Curious, she gripped one loose panel and pulled. The rusted nails resisted before finally giving way with a sharp groan. As the sheet dropped onto the floor, Emily froze. Instead of the solid wall she expected, a dull echo answered from somewhere beyond it. She frowned, reached forward, and gently knocked on the exposed surface. Hollow. Emily knocked on the exposed wall again. Slower this time. The sound was unmistakable. Instead of the dull thud she expected from solid timber or brick, a low echo answered from somewhere behind it. She crouched. Brushing away years of dust with her sleeve, the wooden surface had been covered so carefully that she almost missed the narrow outline running from floor to shoulder height. It looked less like part of the wall and more like something deliberately hidden. She spent the next hour removing the remaining sheets of rusted tin. Most came away only after stubborn nails surrendered to a pry bar she had found beneath the old workbench. By sunset, the concealed section stood fully exposed. It was not another wall at all. It was a heavy iron door, dark with age and framed by thick wooden beams. Rust coated the hinges, but the structure itself appeared remarkably intact. There was no handle, only an old locking mechanism frozen in place near the center of the door. Almost invisible beneath layers of corrosion was a small circular emblem. Emily rubbed it with a rag until faint lines emerged. Interlocking hammers surrounded by a ring of tiny stars had been stamped into the metal decades earlier. She had never seen the symbol before. The following morning she walked into town hoping someone could identify it. Most residents simply shrugged after glancing at the rough sketch she had copied into a notebook. One elderly woman frowned for a moment before admitting she had no idea. A younger mechanic joked that perhaps Emily had discovered an old moonshine cellar. The comments made her smile. But none answered the question that had occupied her thoughts since the previous afternoon. Before returning to the shop, she stopped outside the local hardware store, where an older man was arranging buckets and gardening tools on the sidewalk. He looked up with a welcoming smile.
"You must be the woman who bought the tin shop," he said.
Emily introduced herself, and he offered his hand. Ben Holloway. His handshake was firm but kind. She explained that she needed stronger pry bars, penetrating oil, and perhaps advice if he had any experience with old buildings. Ben gathered the supplies without hesitation. "That place has been empty a long time," he said.
"Long enough for people to stop wondering what was left inside."
Emily showed him the sketch of the emblem. His expression changed almost instantly. The easy smile faded, replaced by quiet surprise. He studied the drawing longer than she expected. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "On an iron door behind one of the walls." Ben remained silent for several seconds before carefully folding the paper and handing it back. "That's an old mark," he said quietly. "Older than anyone still working in this town." "Do you know what it means?" "Only that my grandfather used to mention it once in a while. He never explained much." He hesitated before adding, "Some things disappear for reasons people forget." The answer raised more questions than it solved. But Emily sensed he had shared all he was willing to say. After thanking him, she loaded the supplies into her car and drove back to the shop. She spent the afternoon cleaning around the iron door, removing dirt packed into the frame and soaking the lock with oil. Nothing moved. The mechanism seemed welded together by time itself. Late in the day, footsteps echoed outside. A man carrying a toolbox stood in the doorway. "Heard somebody bought this place," he said. "Name's Noah Brooks. I build cabinets and fix old buildings when they refuse to stay standing." Emily laughed softly. "This one may be beyond saving." Noah glanced around the room before noticing the exposed door. "Well, that's unexpected." Without asking unnecessary questions, he examined the hinges and suggested removing layers of rust before trying to force the lock. They worked together through the afternoon, scraping metal, tightening loose boards nearby, and clearing debris that had collected around the threshold. Conversation came easily despite having met only hours earlier. Noah admitted he had assumed no outsider would last more than a week in Ash Creek. Emily confessed she was trying not to think beyond tomorrow. By evening, the hinges finally shifted with a reluctant groan, but the lock remained stubborn. Noah stepped back. "One more try." Together they pushed against the iron. A sharp crack echoed through the shop as decades of rust finally gave way. The heavy door opened only a few inches before stopping against something inside. Dust drifted into the fading sunlight. Emily reached through the narrow gap with a flashlight. The beam disappeared into darkness before catching the edges of wooden shelves beyond. She widened the opening just enough to squeeze inside. The hidden room smelled dry rather than damp, as though it had been sealed before moisture could reach it. Boxes lined one wall beneath thick blankets of dust. Shelves filled the opposite side. Everything had remained untouched for generations. Noah swept his flashlight across the entrance while Emily stepped closer to the nearest shelf. Ben appeared unexpectedly in the doorway behind them, breathing slightly harder, as if he had hurried from town. The moment his eyes settled on the room, his face turned pale. He stared at the old emblem above the doorway before looking directly at Emily. "Don't open anything," he said quietly. "Not until you know what you're looking at." Emily looked from Ben to the silent shelves stretching into the darkness. Then, with careful hands, she reached toward the nearest dust-covered box. Emily paused with her hand resting on the dusty wooden box. Ben's warning lingered in the silence. But curiosity had already taken hold. She looked at him. "I'm not trying to take anything," she said gently. "I just want to understand why someone sealed this room." Ben stepped inside, his eyes moving slowly across the shelves. "Then be careful," he replied. "Some things survive because nobody touches them." Noah set his flashlight on a nearby crate, adding a steady pool of light to the narrow room. Together they brushed away years of dust from the nearest shelf. Instead of valuables, they found rows of leather-bound ledgers stacked with surprising precision. Time had darkened the covers, but the stitching remained intact. Emily carefully lifted the first volume. Fine dust drifted into the air as she opened it. Every page was filled with neat, handwritten entries dated more than 80 years earlier. Names, deliveries, payments, inventories, meeting notes, and signatures stretched across page after page in remarkably organized handwriting. "These aren't business records," Noah observed quietly. "They're more detailed than that." Emily nodded. Each ledger carried the same embossed symbol she had seen on the iron door. The circle of interlocking hammers surrounded by small stars. Beneath the emblem appeared the same words, repeated in faded ink. Guild of Tin Workers. She had never heard the name before, yet whoever maintained these books had treated every entry with extraordinary care. The shelves held dozens more. Some contained rolled maps tied with cloth ribbons. Others stored carefully labeled envelopes and bundles of correspondence wrapped in twine. Nothing suggested panic or abandonment. Instead, the room looked as though someone had intentionally preserved its contents before locking the door for the last time. Ben removed his cap and slowly exhaled. "My grandfather wasn't imagining things," he murmured. Emily glanced toward him. "You've heard this name before?" "Only in passing. He called them craftsmen who looked after one another. That's all he ever said." "Why would anyone hide records like these?" Ben gave a small shake of his head. "I don't know." Emily returned her attention to the ledger. Every few pages listed workers assigned to repair roofs, build storage sheds, or fabricate metal fittings for homes and businesses throughout Ash Creek. Beside many names appeared careful notes about supplies distributed without payment, or families receiving assistance after accidents. The records seemed less concerned with profit than with helping people keep their lives together. Noah leaned closer. "Whoever kept these books cared about every detail," Emily agreed. The handwriting rarely changed, suggesting only a handful of people had maintained the ledgers over many years. As they continued examining the shelves, they uncovered additional volumes arranged chronologically. The oldest dated back decades before the shop itself appeared in county records. It was as though the hidden room had quietly witnessed generations of work while the town above gradually forgot it existed. They carried only a few books into the main workshop, unwilling to disturb more than necessary. Emily spread an old blanket across the cleaned workbench before laying the ledgers side by side. Sunlight through the cracked windows illuminated faded ink that remained surprisingly readable. She began organizing them by year while Noah gently brushed dust from the covers using a soft paintbrush he found among the old tools. Ben remained nearby, unusually quiet. Hours passed as Emily skimmed entries. Certain surnames appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Many matching names still displayed on mailboxes around Ash Creek. Entire families had belonged to the guild. She wondered whether their descendants even knew these books existed. Near the bottom of one stack, she discovered a ledger noticeably thinner than the others. The cover bore heavier wear, suggesting it had been consulted often before the room was sealed. She opened it carefully. Instead of inventories, the first pages listed officers and committee members. Her eyes moved slowly down the names until one stopped her completely. Carter. She frowned and read the full entry again. Thomas Carter. The surname was uncommon enough to catch her attention immediately. She turned another page. Thomas Carter appeared again, this time supervising repairs after a workshop fire.
Several pages later, he signed approval for materials distributed to injured workers.
Emily's heartbeat quickened. "That's my family name," she whispered. Noah looked up. "You think it's a relative?" "I don't know." She had grown up hearing only fragments about her father's side of the family. Most of their history had been lost long before she was born, reduced to scattered photographs and stories that never reached further back than her grandparents. Seeing the name preserved so carefully inside an 80-year-old ledger felt strangely personal. She continued reading. Thomas Carter's name appeared frequently across the following pages, attached to projects, meetings, and decisions affecting the Guild. Then, without warning, everything changed. The final section of the ledger contained only a handful of entries. On the last completed page, Thomas Carter's name appeared one final time. Unlike every earlier mention, this one had been crossed out with a thick red line drawn firmly through every letter. No explanation followed. No replacement name appeared beneath it. Only the bold mark remained, as though someone wanted future readers to remember that the name had been deliberately erased. Emily stared silently at the page, unable to look away. Emily remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the thick red line crossing through Thomas Carter's name. It was not the hurried mark of someone correcting a mistake. Whoever had drawn it had done so slowly and deliberately, pressing hard enough that the ink bled into the aging paper. Noah leaned over the workbench. "That's impossible to miss," he said quietly. Emily nodded without looking away. Someone wanted everyone to know his name had been removed. Ben studied the page from across the table. Or forgotten. The words settled heavily over the room. Emily carefully closed the ledger before any loose pages could shift. If this guild kept records this carefully, there has to be another explanation somewhere. Ben rested both hands on the edge of the bench. There used to be one person who knew more local history than anyone else. "Who?" Emily asked. "Clara Jennings. She spent nearly 40 years running the town library before retiring. If anyone remembers the Guild, it'll be Clara." The library occupied one of the oldest brick buildings in Ash Creek. Though modest in size, it had been lovingly maintained. Wooden shelves lined the walls, and afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows onto polished floors worn smooth by generations of visitors. Behind the front desk sat an elderly woman with neatly pinned silver hair, reading a thick hardcover book. She looked up as the bell above the entrance chimed. "You must be Emily," she said before Emily had introduced herself. "News travels fast around here." Emily smiled politely. "I suppose buying the old tin shop made me memorable." Clara returned the smile. "It certainly made people curious." Emily explained what she had found, leaving out only the exact location of the hidden room. When she mentioned the Guild of Tin Workers, Clara's expression softened with recognition rather than surprise. She slowly removed her reading glasses and folded them beside the book. "I wondered if that name would ever return," she said. Emily leaned forward. "So it was real?" "Very real." Clara invited them to a small reading table near the local history shelves. She disappeared briefly into a back room before returning with several worn binders containing newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and copies of town records collected over decades. "Most people remember Ash Creek because of the mines," Clara began. "But before the mining companies grew powerful, skilled craftsmen kept this town alive. Roofs, tools, workshops, water tanks, grain storage, bridges. Much of it depended on local metal workers. Many belonged to the Guild." Emily listened carefully as Clara spread several documents across the table. None mentioned treasure or secret wealth. Instead, they described community projects, apprenticeships, and charitable repairs completed after storms or fires. The Guild seemed woven into nearly every part of early Ash Creek. "Then what happened?" Emily asked. Clara paused before answering. One night, there was a fire. She pointed to a faded newspaper clipping. The headline described flames consuming a workshop near the center of town. According to the article, records had supposedly been destroyed and the guild dissolved soon afterward. Was the fire an accident? Noah asked. Clara gave a slow shrug. No official report ever settled the question. After that, people stopped talking about the guild. New businesses arrived. Older stories faded. Within a generation, few remembered they had ever existed. Emily looked again at the copied newspaper. The article mentioned losses, but offered surprisingly little detail about the organization itself. It's as if someone wanted them erased, she said softly. Clara did not immediately answer. History isn't always erased by burning books, she finally replied. Sometimes people simply stop telling the story. Before Emily could ask another question, the library's front door opened. A well-dressed man in his late 60s entered with measured confidence. He greeted Clara politely before noticing the documents spread across the table. His eyes settled briefly on the copied guild records. "Good afternoon," he said. Clara acknowledged him. Harold Price. Emily stood and introduced herself. Harold shook her hand politely. "I've heard you're restoring the old tin shop." "I'm trying." "Ambitious project." His tone remained pleasant, but his attention lingered on the papers a moment longer than seemed casual. "Old buildings can become expensive surprises." Emily smiled. "I'm beginning to understand that." Harold nodded. "If you decide the work is more than you expected, I'd be interested in purchasing the property. I've been buying several older buildings around town for redevelopment." Emily considered the offer only briefly. "I appreciate that, but I just bought it. I'd like to see what I can make of it first." Harold accepted the answer without argument. "Fair enough." He reached into his jacket and handed her a business card. "My offer stands if you ever change your mind." After exchanging a few more polite words with Clara, he left the library as quietly as he had entered. Noah watched him through the window until he disappeared down the sidewalk. "He moved on quickly," Noah observed. Clara gathered the old papers into neat stacks. "Harold usually does." Emily slipped the business card into her pocket without much thought. The visit had given her something far more valuable than an offer to sell. The guild had truly existed, and the hidden room beneath her shop had preserved records everyone believed were gone. As they prepared to leave, Clara rested one hand gently on the oldest binder. "History has a way of asking for patience," she said. "Be careful not to rush to conclusions." Emily thanked her and returned to the shop. Before sunset, the ledgers waited exactly where she had left them. She looked around the quiet workshop, then at the hidden room beyond the iron door. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but expectant. A short time later, footsteps stopped outside. Harold stood near the entrance, his expression still calm, but noticeably more serious than before. "One last thing," he said. Emily looked up. "Yes?" Harold glanced toward the back of the building before meeting her eyes again. "Some parts of the past are better left where they are. I'd think carefully before digging any deeper." Harold's warning followed Emily long after he left the shop. She stood alone beside the workbench, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps outside, and wondered why a successful businessman cared what she read in a room no one had opened for decades. His words had not sounded like a threat, yet they carried enough weight to make the building feel smaller around her. For several minutes she considered locking the iron door and leaving the records untouched. Then she looked at the ledger containing Thomas Carter's name beneath the red line. Whatever had happened, someone had already decided which parts of the past deserved to survive. Emily was not willing to let that decision stand without understanding it. The next morning, Noah arrived with coffee and found her comparing several ledgers across the workbench. "You didn't sleep much," he said. "Neither did these records," Emily replied.
They've been waiting longer. Together, they examined the volumes in chronological order. At first, the entries appeared complete, with dates, signatures, supply lists, and meeting notes following a consistent pattern. But when Emily reached the months before the workshop fire, she noticed abrupt gaps. One page ended with a routine report about damaged roofs on the east side of town. The next began nearly 3 weeks later without explanation. In another ledger, the numbering skipped from page 146 to page 151. The binding was intact, but thin strips of torn paper remained near the spine. Someone had removed the missing pages carefully enough to preserve the book. Noah ran one finger above the torn edges without touching them. "These didn't fall out. No," Emily said. "They were taken." They checked every volume from the same period. Several had similar gaps, always near entries involving guild officers or financial decisions. One bundle of meeting notes had entire sections cut away, leaving only dates and partial signatures. Thomas Carter's name appeared before several of the missing portions, but never after them. The pattern transformed Emily's unease into determination. The red line had not been an isolated act. Parts of the guild's history had been deliberately removed. Ben arrived near midday, carrying sandwiches wrapped in paper. He noticed the open ledgers and frowned. "You've been busy." Emily showed him the torn bindings. "Do you know where older town records were kept before the library moved into its current building?" Ben thought for a moment. "The library has used that building longer than I've been alive. But Clara once told me the lower storage rooms were closed years ago. Water damage. I think, could guild documents have been stored there? If anyone would know, Clara would." They returned to the library that afternoon. Clara listened without interrupting as Emily described the missing pages. When shown photographs of the torn ledgers, she adjusted her glasses and studied them closely. This was deliberate. Clara said at last, "Libraries preserve gaps as often as they preserve answers." She led them past the local history shelves to a narrow hallway behind the main desk. At its end stood a locked wooden door bearing a faded sign that read, "Archive Storage." Clara selected a large iron key from a ring in her pocket. "Most of the basement was cleared decades ago," she explained. "But one room remained sealed because the shelving became unstable. I was told it held duplicate town records and unprocessed donations." The key turned with difficulty. Beyond the door, a steep staircase descended into cool darkness. Noah tested each step before allowing Emily and Clara to follow. At the bottom, they entered a low room crowded with boxes, broken cabinets, and shelving that leaned at dangerous angles. The smell of paper, dust, and old stone filled the air. Clara pointed to a row of wooden crates marked with years rather than subjects. "Anything donated before proper cataloging may be in those." Sorting the room proved slow and frustrating. Many boxes held tax notices, school registers, outdated business permits, and newspapers damaged beyond use. Dust coated their clothes. One shelf shifted when Noah moved a crate, forcing them to stop and brace it with a length of timber. Emily's hands grew sore from lifting lids swollen by age, but every empty search strengthened her belief that the missing records might be there. Near the back wall, she noticed a faint version of the guild emblem drawn in pencil on the side of a narrow cabinet. The doors had been tied shut with brittle cord. Inside were folders containing property surveys, workshop licenses, and correspondence between the guild and the town council. Several documents matched dates missing from the ledgers, yet none explained Thomas Carter's removal. At the bottom of the cabinet sat a shallow metal tray. Noah pulled it forward, revealing a series of symbols etched into its underside. 3 interlocking hammers, followed by a small star and the number 7. Emily had seen the same sequence written in the margin of one ledger beside a missing page. "This is connected," she said.
Clara examined the symbols, then looked toward a row of numbered storage compartments built into the stone wall. Most hung open or had lost their doors. Compartment 7 remained closed beneath layers of dust. Its small latch had rusted, but Noah loosened it with a screwdriver. Inside lay a single cream-colored envelope, yellowed at the edges, but protected from moisture by the sealed compartment. The guild emblem had been pressed into red wax on the back. Emily lifted it carefully. No address appeared on the front, only a name written in dark ink: Thomas Carter. Her breath caught. For years, her family history had felt distant and incomplete, but now an unopened message addressed to a man who might be her great-grandfather rested in her hands. Clara stood beside her in silence. Noah glanced toward the envelope but did not urge her to open it. Emily turned it over, studying the unbroken wax seal. Whoever had placed it there had expected Thomas Carter to receive it, yet somehow the letter had remained hidden while his name was erased from the guild records. She slid one finger beneath the edge of the flap and stopped just before breaking the seal. Emily held the envelope above the metal tray, her fingers still resting beneath the sealed flap. The name Thomas Carter stared back at her in dark, careful handwriting. Clara moved an old wooden chair closer, while Noah cleared dust from a nearby desk so Emily would have a stable place to open the letter. No one spoke. Breaking the seal felt less like opening a forgotten document and more like crossing a boundary someone had protected for 80 years. Emily pressed gently against the brittle wax. It cracked with a soft snap. Inside was a folded sheet of thick paper covered in close handwriting. The ink had faded to brown, but the words remained legible. She began reading silently, then stopped after the first few lines. "It's written by Thomas," she said. Clara sat beside her. Read it aloud. Emily drew a careful breath. The letter was not addressed to one person. It was a statement meant for the guild officers. Thomas Carter admitted responsibility for money missing from the guild's accounts. He wrote that he had acted without authorization, concealed withdrawals, and violated the trust placed in him. He asked that no other member be questioned or punished. The final paragraph requested that his name be removed from all guild positions and records. Emily's voice weakened as she reached the signature. Thomas had written his name firmly beneath the confession, followed by the date 2 days before the workshop fire. For several moments, only the faint creak of the old building broke the silence. "So he did it," Emily whispered. The conclusion hurt more than she expected. She had known almost nothing about the man that morning, yet the records had allowed her to imagine him as dependable and generous. Now his own words seemed to confirm that he had betrayed the organization he once served. Noah leaned against the desk, his expression thoughtful. He admitted taking money. That doesn't explain why the letter was hidden here. Maybe they never received it. Emily said, or someone wanted to preserve proof after everything else disappeared. Clara extended her hand. Emily passed her the statement. The retired librarian read it twice, moving one finger beneath each line. Instead of accepting its meaning, she frowned. "This confession is too neat." Emily looked at her. "He signed it. A signature proves he wrote the words. It does not prove the words are true." Clara pointed to the phrasing in the middle of the letter. Thomas accepted responsibility for the missing funds but never identified the amount, the dates, or what he had supposedly done with the money. For records maintained with extraordinary precision, the confession contained almost no practical detail. "He may have been protecting someone," Noah said. Emily remembered the earlier ledgers, where Thomas approved supplies for injured workers and emergency repairs. "Then we need to know how much money disappeared." They carried the envelope and several relevant folders upstairs, where the library's reading tables offered better light. Clara found copies of annual financial statements from the same period, while Emily and Noah returned to the tin shop to collect the ledgers surrounding the missing dates. By late afternoon, the workbench in the shop had become a maze of open books, copied totals, and handwritten calculations. The task was slow because the guild had separated income, dues, material purchases, loans, and relief payments into different volumes. Emily created a simple table in her notebook and checked every figure twice. The final approved balance before the missing pages showed a large reserve. Several weeks later, the next surviving entry showed it dramatically reduced. On the surface, that supported the accusation. But Clara noticed that the later total had been copied forward incorrectly. They followed the entries backward, comparing receipts and payment authorizations. The numbers refused to support the confession. "Look here," Clara said, tapping a column of withdrawals. "These amounts were entered as one combined loss, but each transaction has a separate reference mark." Oh, found the same marks beside older entries for roofing materials, medical expenses, and emergency family assistance. Emily added the listed withdrawals one by one. When she reached the final number, she checked it again, certain she had made a mistake. The amount supposedly stolen was almost exactly equal to the documented payments scattered across several other books. The money had not vanished. It had been distributed. "Then why confess?" Emily asked. Clara studied the records in silence. "Because someone wanted those payments treated as theft, or because revealing where the money went would have placed other people in danger." Emily turned back to Thomas's letter. His demand that no one else be questioned now sounded less like guilt and more like protection. Yet the documents still lacked the missing pages that might explain who authorized the payments or why they had to remain secret. Near sunset, Noah noticed a faint mark beneath Thomas's signature. It was so light they had mistaken it for a stain, 3 interlocking hammers, a small star, and a short diagonal line. Emily retrieved the ledger in which the same sequence had led them to compartment 7. This version contained an extra stroke. Clara searched the old property surveys from the archive and found the guild emblem beside several former buildings. One survey used tiny lines to distinguish their functions. A straight line marked the workshop. 2 lines marked storage. The diagonal stroke appeared beside a rectangular structure near the abandoned rail spur on the edge of Ash Creek. "A warehouse," Clara said. Ben arrived as they were preparing to leave and recognized the location immediately. The building had survived, though no road directly reached it anymore. According to him, the roof had partially collapsed, and the surrounding ground became muddy after rain. "You won't get inside safely tonight," he warned. Emily folded Thomas's confession into a protective sleeve Clara had provided. The letter had answered one question, but the guild's own arithmetic had created another. Thomas Carter had accepted disgrace for money that the records suggested was never stolen. Someone else had shaped the accusation, and the missing explanation might still exist in the place marked by his final symbol. Emily looked at the old survey and placed her finger over the abandoned warehouse. At first light, Emily, Noah. Ben and Clara followed the old survey toward the abandoned rail spur on the eastern edge of Ash Creek. The road ended well before the warehouse, forcing them to continue on foot through wet grass and uneven ground. Overnight rain had softened the earth, and each step pulled at Emily's boots. Ahead, beyond a line of scrub trees, the building emerged slowly from the morning fog. Its corrugated roof had collapsed over one corner, and several wall panels hung loose, rattling whenever the wind moved through them. Ben stopped at the edge of the clearing. "That place hasn't been used since I was a boy," he said. "Maybe longer." Noah examined the entrance before allowing anyone near it. The main doors had warped inward, and one support beam leaned at an unsafe angle. He circled the building, testing the ground and looking for another way inside. At the rear, partially hidden by vines, they found a narrow service door bearing the faint outline of the guild emblem. The lock had already rusted away, but the frame refused to move until Noah worked a pry bar beneath it. The door opened with a sharp crack, releasing a smell of damp timber, dust, and old metal. Inside, pale light filtered through holes in the roof. Broken crates lay scattered across the floor, mixed with rusted tools and lengths of ruined sheet metal. Clara unfolded the survey and compared it with the room. "The mark should be near the western wall," she said. They moved carefully, avoiding areas where rain had weakened the floorboards. Emily's excitement gave way to frustration as every cabinet they opened proved empty or filled with damaged receipts too faded to read. Several drawers had swollen shut. Others contained only nails, hinges, and scraps of cloth. After nearly an hour, Ben found a row of numbers stamped into one wall beam. Beneath the number 7 was the same diagonal stroke they had seen under Thomas Carter's signature. Noah tapped the boards below it. The first two sounded solid. The third answered with a hollow echo. They cleared away a stack of rotting planks and discovered a square iron plate set into the floor. Mud had sealed its edges, and the recessed handle would not lift. Noah scraped it clean, while Emily poured penetrating oil around the hinges. Together they pulled until the plate rose several inches, revealing a shallow compartment lined with tin. Inside rested a long metal box wrapped in oilcloth. The cloth had decayed at the corners, but the box remained dry. Emily carried it toward a stable work table near the entrance. A simple latch held the lid closed. No emblem appeared on the outside. Only the initials T.C. scratched near one end. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The box contained a thick ledger, several folded receipts, and a bundle of signed payment slips tied with faded blue ribbon. Unlike the ledgers in the hidden room, this book had no title stamped on its cover. The first page read, "Private Relief Account." Emily turned to the next page and found names arranged in narrow columns beside dates and carefully recorded amounts. Some entries included brief notes. Widow after mine collapse, medicine for injured roofer, rent assistance during winter, food for children, funeral expenses. Clara read over her shoulder, her expression tightening with emotion. "These are the payments that disappeared from the official account." Emily compared the reference marks with the calculations in her notebook. Every symbol matched. The missing guild money had been transferred into this private ledger, then distributed in small amounts throughout Ash Creek. Page after page documented assistance to families who could not have survived without it. Some received only a few dollars. Others were given building materials, medical support, or temporary housing. Noah turned one receipt toward the light. They hid the names because these people might have been punished for accepting help. Ben nodded. The mining companies controlled wages, housing, even credit at the stores. Anyone organizing outside their system would have been seen as a problem. Emily felt a painful mixture of relief and anger. Thomas Carter had not stolen the money. He had helped conceal where it went, then accepted blame when the guild came under pressure. His confession had protected every worker, widow, and child listed in the book. The realization made the red line through his name seem even crueler. He had preserved the dignity of others by surrendering his own. They continued through the ledger, matching totals against receipts. Clara found several payment slips signed by different guild officers, proving the relief account had not been Thomas's private operation. It was organized, approved, and carefully maintained. The official records had been altered later to make the entire fund appear stolen. Near the middle of the book, Emily found a series of acknowledgments signed by recipients or witnesses. Many surnames were familiar from town signs, mailboxes, and businesses still operating in Ash Creek. She imagined their descendants walking past the old tin shop without knowing how closely their families were tied to the hidden room inside it. "This could change what people believe about the guild," she said. "It could change what they believe about Thomas." Noah replied. Emily looked at him, grateful for the certainty in his voice. Until that moment, she had not realized how much she needed someone else to say it. A sudden groan sounded above them. Part of the damaged roof shifted, dropping dust and splinters onto the floor. Noah ordered everyone outside while he secured the ledger and documents inside the metal box. They reached the clearing moments before a section of roofing collapsed where they had been standing. The practical danger ended their search. Whatever else the warehouse held would have to wait until the structure could be stabilized. Back at the tin shop, they spread the recovered records across the workbench. Clara began arranging the receipts by date, while Ben compared names with older town directories. Emily opened the ledger near the final pages, looking for a closing statement or explanation from Thomas. Instead, she found a sheet folded into the binding. It listed guild officers who had authorized the relief payments. Several signatures were faded, but one remained clear. Emily recognized the surname immediately: Price. Beneath it, written in full, was the name of Harold Price's father. Emily read the signature twice before looking up from the recovered ledger. "Harold's father knew," she said. Clara adjusted her glasses and examined the page. The handwriting matched several earlier guild authorizations, and the date placed the signature only weeks before Thomas Carter's confession. Noah stood beside Emily, his arms folded. "Then Harold may know why Thomas took the blame." Ben glanced toward the shop windows as though expecting Harold to appear outside. "His family has owned half the commercial property in Ash Creek for generations. People listen when a Price tells them which version of history is respectable." Emily closed the ledger carefully. Anger pressed against her exhaustion, but she did not want another vague warning or polite offer for the property. She wanted an answer. She placed Thomas's confession, the private relief ledger, and a copy of the signed authorization into a canvas folder. Noah offered to accompany her. "You shouldn't go alone." Emily nodded, grateful that he did not try to take the decision from her. They found Harold in his office above a renovated storefront on Main Street. Framed photographs of Ash Creek hung along the walls, most showing buildings restored through his company. He greeted them with controlled politeness until Emily placed the copied signature on his desk. His expression hardened. "Where did you get this?" "The guild warehouse," Emily replied. "Your father authorized payments from the relief account." Thomas Carter confessed to stealing that same money 2 days before the fire. But the money wasn't stolen. It went to injured workers, widows, and children. Harold remained standing behind his desk. Old documents can be misunderstood. Emily opened the private ledger. The totals match. So do the reference marks. Your father signed the authorizations. Hard stared at the page without touching it. The silence lasted long enough for the sounds of traffic below to become noticeable. Finally, he lowered himself into his chair. "My father was young when he joined the guild," he said. "He handled accounts because he was educated and good with numbers. The mining company had begun cutting wages and removing families from company housing after accidents. The guild used its reserve to help them." "Why hide it?" Noah asked. Harold's mouth tightened. "Because the company considered any independent relief fund an attempt to undermine its authority. Workers who accepted help could lose their jobs. Shop owners who supported the guild could lose contracts. The town council depended on mining money. Everyone understood the risk." Emily thought of the names listed beside medicine, rent, and funeral expenses. Thomas protected them. Harold nodded reluctantly. When an audit was demanded, the guild had 2 choices: reveal every recipient or make the money appear stolen. Thomas volunteered to accept responsibility. He had fewer family ties in town than the others, and believed he could leave after the matter settled. But his name was erased, Emily said, and the guild disappeared. Harold looked toward the photographs on the wall. The fire changed everything. Records were believed destroyed. The company used the scandal to discredit the guild permanently. My father knew Thomas was innocent, but he remained silent. Fear at first. Later, shame. By the time the mines declined, he had built a business and a reputation. Telling the truth would have meant admitting that his success began while another man carried his disgrace. Emily struggled to contain her disappointment. And you continued the lie? Harold looked directly at her. I continued the silence. There is a difference, though perhaps not enough of one. He explained that his father had told him the truth near the end of his life, but made him promise never to reopen the matter. Harold had spent years protecting the family name and the civic projects financed by their company. If the story became public, he feared people would see every contribution through the lens of cowardice and betrayal. That is why you wanted the shop, Emily said. I wanted control of whatever remained inside it. His admission carried no pride. I thought the room contained only fragments. I did not know the private ledger survived. Noah stepped closer to the desk. You warned Emily because you were protecting yourself. Harold gave a tired nod. And my father, I spent my life believing preserving his good deeds required burying his worst decision. Emily looked at Thomas's confession inside the folder. He had lost his name so vulnerable families could keep theirs hidden. Harold's father had allowed that sacrifice to become a permanent accusation. The contrast left little room for sympathy. Yet Harold's fear seemed painfully human rather than calculated. I'm going to make the records public, she said. Harold rose. You don't understand what that will do. It will restore the truth. It may divide this town. Some families will not want their hardships displayed. Others will blame people who are no longer alive to defend themselves. Emily had considered that danger. The relief recipient's private details can be protected, but Thomas Carter and the Guild will not remain branded as thieves. Harold walked to the window and stared down at Main Street. People resist history when it threatens the stories they inherited. Then they can see the evidence and decide for themselves. Back at the tin shop, Emily told Clara and Ben everything Harold had admitted. Clara agreed to help prepare an exhibition using copies of the records while protecting sensitive names. Noah offered to repair the front room so visitors could enter safely. Ben began contacting older families who might recognize Guild members. For the first time, the neglected shop filled with purposeful movement. They cleaned display cases, photographed ledgers, and arranged a timeline from the Guild's early community work to Thomas's confession and the fire. Emily drafted a public notice announcing that newly recovered records would be presented at the shop. By evening, copies appeared in the library, hardware store, diner, and post office. Reactions came quickly. Some residents expressed excitement. Others accused Emily of stirring up trouble she did not understand. One man tore down a notice outside the diner. A woman whose grandfather had worked for the mining company warned Ben that old accusations could damage living families. Anonymous notes appeared beneath the shop door telling Emily to leave the past alone. She read each one, then returned to mounting Thomas's signed statement beside the financial proof that contradicted it. Near sunset, a crowd gathered across the street. Their voices rose as more people joined them, some demanding that the exhibition be canceled before it opened. Emily stood behind the cracked front window, watching neighbors argue over a history they had not yet seen, and realized the truth had begun dividing Ash Creek before she had revealed a single page. The crowd outside the tin shop was smaller the following morning, but the tension remained. Some people entered quietly to examine the displays Emily and her friends had prepared. Others stood near the doorway with folded arms, unwilling to accept that a forgotten collection of ledgers could rewrite stories repeated for generations. Emily greeted every visitor the same way. She made no speeches and offered no accusations. Instead, she invited each person to begin with the earliest guild records, then follow the documents in chronological order. Clara remained beside the display cases, answering questions with the patience of a lifelong librarian. Ben pointed out familiar family names in the community repair records, while Noah ensured every fragile ledger stayed protected behind glass. The exhibition slowly transformed from an argument into a conversation. Older residents lingered over the pages far longer than younger visitors. Some recognized signatures belonging to grandparents or great-uncles. One elderly woman quietly placed her hand over her mouth after finding her grandmother's surname beside an entry for emergency roofing materials following a winter storm. She whispered that her family had always wondered how the house had survived that year when no one could afford repairs. Another man stared silently at a payment receipt listing medicine for a minor injured decades before his own birth. "My father told me strangers helped us," he said softly. "He never knew who they were." Emily watched as skepticism gradually gave way to curiosity. No single document changed anyone's mind. It was the weight of hundreds of careful records that spoke for themselves. Every ledger supported another. Every receipt matched an entry. Every date connected naturally to the next. Thomas Carter's confession rested beside the financial calculations, proving the money had been distributed rather than stolen. Visitors spent long minutes comparing the pages themselves. Harold arrived shortly before noon. Conversations briefly quieted as people noticed him walking through the front door. He looked older than he had only the day before. Without speaking, he moved slowly through the exhibition until he reached the private relief ledger. He remained there for several minutes before turning toward the gathered residents. "The records are genuine," he said calmly. "My father knew the guild maintained this relief fund. He also knew Thomas Carter accepted responsibility for protecting those families. Our family remained silent when we should have spoken." A murmur spread across the room. Harold continued before anyone interrupted. "Silence protected our reputation, but it failed the people who deserved the truth. I cannot change what happened. I can only acknowledge it now." Emily saw surprise on several faces. She had expected resistance, not public acceptance. Harold stepped aside without attempting to justify himself further. His admission did not erase decades of misunderstanding, but it removed the final obstacle preventing many people from accepting the documents. Throughout the afternoon, more residents arrived after hearing about the exhibition. Clara quietly added small note cards explaining the historical context of each ledger. Ben produced old town directories confirming the identities of several guild members. Noah repaired a loose display shelf between visitors without interrupting conversations. The little shop no longer felt abandoned. It had become a place where memories returned, one page at a time. Late in the day, a man in his late 80s entered with the careful steps of someone determined not to attract attention. He wore a neatly pressed jacket despite the warm weather and carried a small wooden case tucked beneath one arm. Clara recognized him immediately. "Mr. Ellis," she said with genuine warmth. "I haven't seen you in months." The elderly man smiled faintly. "I heard people were finally talking about the guild again." Emily welcomed him inside and explained the exhibition. He studied the displays slowly, occasionally nodding as though confirming details he had carried in memory for most of his life. When he reached Thomas Carter's confession, he remained silent for a long time. Finally, he looked at Emily. "Your great-grandfather visited my parents after my father died in a mining accident," he said. "I was only a little boy, but I remember him bringing food, blankets, and enough money to keep us in our home until my mother found work. She told me never to ask where it came from." Emily felt emotion tighten her throat. "You remember him?" "Not clearly, but I remember kindness. Mr. Ellis placed the wooden case on the workbench and carefully opened the lid. Resting inside a folded cloth lay a polished bronze badge bearing the familiar guild emblem of interlocking hammers surrounded by small stars. Unlike the worn mark on the iron door, this one remained beautifully preserved. "My mother hid this after the guild disappeared," he explained. "She said one day someone honest would come looking for the truth. I believe that day has finally arrived." Clara gently lifted the badge, turning it so everyone could see. Several older residents recognized the symbol immediately, though none had seen an original before. The badge matched the emblems stamped throughout the recovered records, providing one more piece of evidence connecting every discovery Emily had made since arriving in Ash Creek. Harold quietly stepped closer. "My father described those badges," he admitted. "I never believed one still existed." Mr. Ellis smiled sadly. "Many things survive because ordinary people refuse to throw them away." As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Emily and her friends carefully returned the ledgers to their protective cases. The exhibition had accomplished more than she imagined. People who arrived doubtful had left asking new questions. Families had rediscovered forgotten connections to one another. Thomas Carter's name was no longer spoken with suspicion, but with growing respect. Emily believed the hardest part of the journey might finally be behind her, while closing the final display cabinet. She noticed something unusual beneath the felt lining of the wooden case that had protected the guild badge. A narrow compartment had been built into the bottom, almost invisible unless viewed from the side. She carefully slid a finger beneath the loose edge and lifted it. Inside rested a small brass key wrapped in yellowed cloth, along with a handwritten note containing only 4 words: "For the final archive." Emily held the tiny key in her hand, staring at it as the shop fell silent once again. Emily turned the small brass key over in her hand while the others gathered around the workbench. The folded note beneath it contained only 4 words: "For the final archive." Unlike every discovery that had come before, this one carried no symbol, no map, and no explanation. Clara examined the key closely before smiling. Sometimes the simplest clues are the easiest to overlook. Mr. Ellis studied it for a moment, then pointed toward the old display cabinet standing against the far wall of the shop. "When I was a boy, I remember hearing that the guild always kept one cabinet locked, not because it held valuables, but because it contained the papers that explained why the guild existed." Emily looked toward the weathered cabinet. It had stood in the room since she bought the shop. She had cleaned around it, repaired one loose leg, and even stacked boxes beside it, never noticing the tiny brass lock hidden beneath years of paint. The key slid smoothly into place. She hesitated only long enough for everyone to gather beside her before turning it. The lock clicked with surprising ease. Inside rested a single wooden case wrapped in faded cloth. There were no piles of gold coins, no jewels, no hidden fortune. Emily carefully lifted the case onto the workbench and opened it. Inside lay 3 carefully preserved items: the original guild charter, a complete register of every family assisted by the guild's relief fund, and one final sealed letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Clara's eyes filled with quiet emotion as she unfolded the charter. It described the guild's purpose in plain language: to protect skilled workers, support families in hardship, train apprentices, and ensure that no member of the community would face disaster alone if help could be given. Every principle matched what the ledgers had quietly recorded for decades. There had never been a secret fortune. The guild's greatest treasure had always been the people it chose to serve. Emily reached for the final letter. The handwriting was immediately familiar. It belonged to Thomas Carter. She unfolded the paper carefully and began to read aloud. Thomas explained that he knew history might never remember the guild kindly. If the relief records were discovered too soon, the families who depended on them could lose their homes, their work, or their dignity. If they remained hidden, perhaps one day someone living in a different time would understand why the sacrifice had been necessary. He wrote that a good name could be taken away by rumor, fear, or politics, but kindness survived in quieter ways. It lived inside repaired roofs, children who grew into healthy adults, widows who were not forced from their homes, and neighbors who chose compassion over recognition. Near the end of the letter, Thomas addressed the unknown reader directly. "If you are holding this letter," Emily read softly, "then time has finally become kinder than our own. Do not waste your energy restoring my reputation alone. Restore the purpose that made the sacrifice worthwhile. Buildings can be rebuilt. Records can be recovered. But communities survive only when ordinary people decide to care for one another." No one spoke after Emily finished. Even Harold stood silently with his head lowered. After several long moments, he stepped forward. "My father should have spoken," he said quietly. "I should have spoken sooner. I cannot change either failure, but I can help repair what remains." Emily looked at him, seeing neither the confident businessman who had tried to buy the shop nor the frightened man protecting an old promise. She saw someone finally willing to carry his share of the truth. "Then help us preserve it," she replied. Harold nodded. "I will." Over the following weeks, the town council reviewed copies of every recovered document. Clara supervised the preservation of the original records. Ben organized volunteers to restore the workshop without changing its historic character. Noah spent long days repairing floors, rebuilding shelves, and reinforcing the roof, refusing payment beyond the cost of materials. Emily worked beside him whenever she could, and somewhere between shared lunches, long conversations, and evenings spent cataloging ledgers, the friendship that had quietly grown between them became something deeper, built not on dramatic promises but on trust earned one ordinary day at a time. Families visited to identify relatives listed in the guild records. Some discovered ancestors who had received help. Others learned that grandparents they barely remembered had quietly served on repair crews or donated supplies during difficult winters. Instead of creating division, the records gradually reminded the town that hardship had once been shared rather than hidden. Harold publicly apologized during a community meeting for his family's silence and pledged financial support for preserving the guild archive without controlling it. His statement did not erase the past, but it allowed many residents to begin forgiving it. Months later, the restored building officially reopened. The faded sign above the entrance had been replaced with a new one reading, "Guild Workshop and Community Museum." Inside, visitors could see the recovered ledgers, the preserved charter, copies of the relief records with private family details respectfully protected. Thomas Carter's confession displayed beside the financial evidence that proved the money had never been stolen. And the bronze guild badge Mr. Ellis had safeguarded for nearly a lifetime. School children visited to learn local history. Former residents returned to trace their family names. Researchers arrived from neighboring counties after hearing about the remarkable discovery hidden inside an abandoned tin shop that had once sold for only $150. Emily often smiled at the thought that everyone had laughed when she bought the building. They had believed she was purchasing a collapsing structure. In truth, she had inherited a forgotten promise. One quiet morning before the museum opened, Emily stepped outside carrying the restored bronze guild emblem. Noah helped her fasten it above the entrance, where sunlight caught its polished surface. They stood together in silence as the first rays of the day reflected across Main Street. Ash Creek looked different now. Not because every problem had disappeared, but because its people finally understood a part of themselves they had almost lost forever. Emily thought back to the exhausted woman who had left the city, believing she was running away from a life that no longer fit. She had arrived searching for peace and a place to begin again. Instead, she found a community waiting for its history to be remembered. The little tin shop had never contained hidden wealth. Its true value had always rested inside the lives changed by quiet generosity and the courage of one man willing to surrender his own good name so others could keep their hope. As the museum doors opened and the first visitors walked inside, Emily looked once more at the shining guild emblem above her head and realized that some legacies are never measured by what people leave behind, but by the kindness they inspire long after they are gone. Some treasures are never buried beneath the ground or locked inside forgotten rooms. They live in acts of quiet generosity, in sacrifices made without the expectation of recognition, and in ordinary people who choose compassion over personal gain. Emily's journey reminds us that our greatest inheritance is not wealth, but the courage, kindness, and integrity passed from one generation to the next. History may overlook good people for a time, and truth may remain hidden for years. But genuine acts of selflessness have a way of finding their way back into the light. In the end, the value of a life is measured not by what we keep for ourselves, but by what we leave behind for others. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness becomes the legacy that changes countless lives long after we are gone.